This conference will now be recorded.
All right, hey guys, it's just after 7 o'clock, so we're gonna get this party started. Thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Crystal. I am the president of the Rose Society of Tucson, and I want to say thank you guys for joining us tonight. I know I'd rather be seeing you guys in person, but not yet. Sorry. But hopefully it'll be sooner rather than later. All right, I'm gonna be honest with you guys. My computer crashed a couple weeks ago, so I'm doing everything on my tablet, and it looks a little weird. So I can only see 6 of you. But if you are new, if this is your first meeting, thank you for joining us. Couple reminders while our presenter or anybody else is speaking. If you could just turn off your microphones so we don't get the background noise, and we can hear the presentation, which I'm particularly excited about because it's who I am as a person. Having said that, Les, I think you're here, right?
Crystal,
There you are.
Crystal,
Oh,
could you
Liz, yes.
people, including Les, how to get his picture on the screen at the down at the bottom of the screen? There's a place that says camera that he could click on so we could see him. Does that make sense?
Just a minute.
Les, do you see the little camera? Do you see the little camera button?
No, we should have the people bring.
You have to move your cursor down there, and it'll pop up.
Yeah, Les looks like his is trying to connect, so.
I have no idea where the bottom of the screen. Okay, you got it.
I want to get back to
Voice
that.
connected, but not his camera.
Breakfast after mass type thing, corporate community or whatever you call it. And something to do with the spouses or girlfriends or significant others. I don't care.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Okay,
Can
well,
we figure it out?
it may not. He's clicked the button, that's why it's black, but I don't know.
Okay.
Well,
Les, are you still there?
I'm here, and I showed
Okay,
on my screen. So
no, not. You want to click on the camera button, not the screen button. The screen button's going to show what's on your computer. So click the one that says camera.
I don't see anything that says camera.
Put your
it'll be
cursor.
it's a little icon.
Doesn't say
It
camera.
doesn't say camera.
Picture of a movie camera,
Right.
Yeah.
a
I
little
see.
icon.
The only one I have is a webcam.
Oh, well, that's the one it should be coming through.
Okay, well, that's what we clicked and
And we have a black screen. Well, that's weird.
says people can see you.
Okay.
So if you can't, we're really sorry.
I'm gonna have to talk as a dark mystery person. So
All
There
right.
you go.
All right. Darkly and mysteriously, Les, what do we do in the garden this month?
all right. We're already experiencing much above normal temperatures, unfortunately. So we need to make sure that our watering is probably the most critical thing. We don't have a show this year, so we can enjoy our roses at home. We can share them with a lot of other people, hopefully, if you have lots of roses. I repotted all my roses this spring. Not into bigger pots, but took them out, put some new soil around them, raised them up, and they have responded just incredibly. So I would highly recommend that to anybody who has some ones that have been in the same pots without being repotted for 2 or 3 or 4 years. Either move them up into larger pots or take them out and repot them. You don't want to do it now while they're in full bloom, but maybe after the first bloom cycle, or wait till next year when they're as dormant as they're going to get in January. I'm feeding about every 10 days. Right now I'm using Magnum Grow. That's pretty much the only thing I use after my first few feedings in the spring. Mine are all in big pots. They get watered very thoroughly every other day and a light watering the in between days, and I wash them off thoroughly, every single morning. I think that's key to Gerri's problem with the spider mite. A lot of times can be controlled just with the water. But if they get bad enough, then you would have to resort to some kind of a spray. I have not sprayed my roses. I see a little bit of thrip damage on some of the white ones, but nowhere near what we've experienced in the past. Like Terry was saying earlier, we didn't have any rains, so we didn't have any wildflowers, and that's where our thrips tend to come in, is from the wildflowers, because they all start to dry up just about the time that the roses come into full bloom, and they're just out looking for a new place to get something to eat. I have not seen any aphids in my yard at all this year, and I usually can control those just with a stream of water. So, and I have not sprayed for thrips. I try to avoid spraying. I did way too much spraying in my younger days and have some a little bit of I think some nerve damage from probably brain damage too, from all the chemicals that I used over the years at the nursery. Has anybody got any questions? Hi, Liz.
I have one. I have some compost that I used on my roses last fall, and I moved it away for, when I pruned. Can I push that back over the top of the crown as a good mulch?
You can put the mulch back on there. I like to leave the crown at least a little bit exposed. I don't want it to be completely out in the open, especially if you don't have good foliage down toward the bottom of your bush, because you don't want that crown to get sunburned. But you can bring the mulch up to almost over to the top of it, but and it won't hurt anything at all. Mulching is a good idea too. I usually, for roses in the pots, mulching is usually just the addition of either a little bit of compost or adding some more potting soil to the top of the pot. In the ground, a good quality compost or some kind of a fairly fine ground mulch, if you can find some. And anytime, you can apply it anytime, but I would certainly try and have it on by the first part of May, when the temperatures get to be what they are right now. That they're right now we're into May temperatures, so, and we're looking at 90s the whole rest of this week and no rain in sight.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to mention, I know Les said he had repotted all of his roses and they're all in containers. I had repotted some of mine, and I had one hybrid tea stainless steel, which I lifted back up and got that graft bud union above the soil, and now I'm getting all these basil breaks just from doing that. There's still mulch around it, but it's beneath the graft bud union. But if you have a grafted rose and you have it in a pot, if you can lift it up and get that graft bud union back above the soil level, you're going to get a lot of basil breaks. And I do recommend that procedure. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. When I repotted mine this year, I did plant them a little bit higher, so my bud unions are sitting higher than they were. And I've gotten a few basil breaks, not a huge amount. I have an old red Floribunda rose. I bought it as a 3-inch pot in Albuquerque about 40 years ago, and it looks better this year than it's ever looked. So, and it got repotted and it sunk way down in the pot, so it has all new soil, and it's on its own roots, and it's sitting up high enough that you can sort of see a few of the roots sitting right on the top of the soil. So I will put a little bit more soil in it later on, but yeah, it's a good 40 years old, and it's just looking spectacular this spring.
And Les, what's the name of that rose?
I'll think of it. I've
Red
had it in
rose.
some shows. I won a trophy up in Phoenix at the district convention with it a couple of years ago. Dusky Maid.
Oh, that's a rose.
It's a red single floribunda.
Yep.
Sprays pretty nice, fairly decent sprays in the. Yeah. Am I on screen or not?
No,
No.
Okay.
Hey, Les, I do have a question if nobody else does. My two Tiffany bushes have already started getting leaves that are turning yellow and falling off. What could cause that, and how do I fix it?
Were they leaves that were left on after you pruned, or did you strip them?
I stripped the entire bush, and it's both of the bushes that are doing this.
I don't know that I can tell you for sure. Sometimes that happens if you either way underfeed or way overfeed, and possibly spider mite. I don't know what else to tell you.
Crystal, I have the same problem, and I'd have to go in the other room and get my CR manual. But do you have a CR manual? Consulting. I mean, not.
I do.
Well, take the leaf that's turning yellow and see if it matches the picture in the manual, and it'll explain what you need to do. You don't need to do it now, but that may answer your question.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions?
Hello?
All right.
Hi. I don't. Is there a way to raise your hand on this program, like in Zoom? I don't know how to do it, but.
No, but there is a chat feature. There's a chat feature up in the corner that you can use. You can message other people individually, or you can message the entire group. And I do check that throughout the meeting, so I don't want anybody getting missed. Anything else?
Oh, sorry. I just had a comment about if anybody's ordered David Austin roses this year.
Yes, I have. I agree with them.
Well, I got my bare root ones, but I ordered a few in the 2-quart pots, and mine are actually coming tomorrow. So I did email them, and they emailed back and said they're just starting to send out the 2-quart pot ones. And I think they're done with bare root.
Yeah, I ordered bare roots from them. They were supposed to ship in January. They didn't ship till March, and then they sent me the wrong roses. But that's a story for another time. Terry.
Sorry.
Oh, one more. Okay.
Just one more comment real quick. So I did order some, first time ever I've ordered a bare root one, and maybe you guys have all done that, but I never have. And man, are they vigorous. They're just, the bare root, own root roses are doing great. And I've probably had them, well, like you say, from March, a few weeks. That's it. Thanks.
You're welcome. All right. So with that, Terry, would you introduce our presenter for today?
I'd be delighted to. Gerri Mahoney is a dear friend and just an excellent rose grower and a fount of knowledge, shall we say that? And I'm so delighted that she had this great program, because I'm so fascinated with history of roses. And I thought, oh, when she told me about this program, I'm like, oh yes, that's what we want. So here she is, Gerri Mahoney.
Well, thank you, Terry. I'm going to show you guys something. I hope my camera will pick it up. Can you see this issue of American Rose? This is the January-February issue. And inside there's an article called Heritage of the Rose. Now, you ask, why is this important to the talk that I'm going to give? This talks about the roses that Empress Josephine grew in her garden that are available today. So if this sparks some interest after we get done talking, and you want to know if any of these can be purchased, obtained in some way, this will tell you which ones are still available. Some of them are available. It says just barely available. There's one, it says, the centifolias that she grew, 4 of the ones that she grew are still just barely available in America. Bulata, which is a medium pink, cabbage-like leaves. You can get that one from Rogue Valley. And I'm going to butcher this one. Laurier Naye, which is a warm pink rose with a very few prickles. The name means the stupid laugh. Roses Unlimited sells that one. So it goes through this whole article and tells you of the ones that she grew, which ones you can still obtain if you're interested in old garden roses. This is a really good article. It does remind people, and I had to go back and check my program to be sure it wasn't something I had said in mine. Josephine was not the first person to grow a primarily rose garden. However, she was a person who developed a lot of roses because she hired people to hybridize. There was a huge competition, and where have we heard that before, between rose growers during her time, and they would steal into each other's gardens and dig up roses and whisk them away to their own gardens. So that's how fierce the competition was. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But if you want to read something that's interesting, it's on page 38 of the American Rose magazine, the January-February issue. If you're not a member of ARS and you didn't get this one, beg, borrow, or plead with someone you know that's an ARS member and see if you can get this copy, because that's a really, really interesting article. So enough said about that. Let me pull up my screen here. I'm going to share my screen. You're going to see a bunch of stuff, but I'm going to pull up my program here, and we'll get this show on the road from the beginning. So let me collapse this so I can get that out of the way. Okay, now you'll have to give me, I cannot tell what I'm doing on the screen because when I have my slideshow up, I can't see my screen. So if I'm looking down, it's because I want to be absolutely sure that what I'm telling you is not something that I thought I heard, but something that's in fact true. So this program is about the garden at Malmaison, which was Josephine's home for a very short time, but she did an awful lot in her brief time there. This picture is a picture of Souvenir de la Malmaison, which was a rose that was named after Josephine's was gone for a long time, but the person who named it did so because it reminded him of her garden. And her comment about the garden was, to see foreign plants multiply in our garden, it's a joy for me. In 10 years' time, I want every French department, which is like a county, to own a collection of precious plants initially grown in our nurseries. So she was not only a big rose fan, but she loved all kinds of plants. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go through the program. So this is a painting of Josephine when she was Empress. And this is a painting of Chateau de la Malmaison when Josephine lived there. This land was passed around and went from pillar to post several different times, but in 1763, it passed to the son of a chancellor, and then in 1771, there was a gentleman named Dumoulin, who was a rich banker of the kingdom, and she was the one who made this place popular. She had salons there and she entertained people. But during the revolution, they had to part with Malmaison and they sold it to Josephine Bonaparte for the sum of 325,000 francs. Now, Napoleon did not know that she was buying this property. She did it without him even realizing that she was doing it. He approved the sale when he returned from Egypt, and he became the true owner of the estate. And for a while, it was the seat of government because he was running the show. And he played host to lots of meetings and foreign dignitaries. When Josephine and Napoleon divorced, he gave her the chateau together with its collections, and she died there in May of 1814. So she didn't live there very long. Her son inherited the property, but his widow sold Malmaison to a Swedish banker. So it went back and forth. It was not always in the hands of the family. And it was sad that by the time Josephine was gone and her son inherited it, the gardens pretty much disappeared. This is the gentleman who helped design the gardens, Louis Martin Berthaud. He was hired and 300 acres were landscaped. Now this is a picture, a painting of what Josephine and Napoleon would have looked like resting in their garden. But he had these 300 acres landscaped with rolling hills and pockets of woods and pavilions and grottos and vineyards. And when Napoleon moved to St. Cloud to run the government, Josephine stayed on and commissioned all kinds of improvements to this house. This is one of the grottos he designed with a little, and you can see the waterfall. This all looks very natural, but he designed it and built it, and then they had gravity-fed things and water wheels to keep the little streams and riverlets running. This is what a garden party at Malmaison would have looked like. During their reign as Emperor and Empress, Josephine spent 2,600 pounds in 1 year with the English nursery of Kennedy and Lee to improve her gardens. Here's another picture of it. This has got the little temple in the background and Napoleon and Josephine and her sisters in the garden. Now, after the divorce in 1809 was when she started all of these improvements. She died at this property in May of 1814. So it was really, really a short time. So while she was planning and planting at Malmaison from 1809 to 1814, there were lots of things going on in the world that affected her trying to get these plants. There was the War of the French Revolution. There was the Tripolitan War, which is United States versus Tripoli. The Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815, which was involving Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia versus France. But Josephine was allowed to bring roses across the enemy lines. The War of 1812 between the US and Britain also affected her gardens because she did have roses from the United States, or what was then the colonies. And Jefferson and Madison were US presidents during part of the time that she was working on the gardens. Now in 1814, Napoleon abdicated the throne, and that's also the year that Josephine died. So despite this naval blockade, the British Admiralty allowed a safe conduct pass to the Kennedy and Lee gardening firm from England. Napoleon instructed the French Army, or pardon me, the French Navy to seize any plants or rose seeds that they found if they searched a ship at sea. And those were to be sent to Josephine. Kennedy was provided with this special passport to deliver new China roses to Malmaison and instructions about how he could prevent the plants from being damaged if they were intercepted. So there was a whole conspiracy to get her these plants. So where were they putting all the plants? Well, this is Malmaison today. This is the main entrance. This is now a state-run, government-run property. It is primarily there as a park and a tourist destination. But you can see the main drive is still where it was. The main gate is still the same. And there's a wonderful alley here with roses and these lovely prune trees. And this is the main entrance. So where do the roses fit in? Here is a better shot. You can see the roses planted along the sides and these evergreens interspersed, and there's topiaries and palms. Now these are planted just as they were during Josephine's time. They were planted in big planter boxes, and in the wintertime, these are citrus trees. They were moved into the orangerie to be protected from the cold, as were the palm trees. Josephine was from Martinique, so she liked the more exotic for France plants. And she had bananas and oranges and all kinds of things growing in her orangerie. So she collected roses for her garden at the chateau from 1805 to 1810. She wanted this to be the most beautiful and curious garden in Europe. That's a direct quote. But her favorite plant was the rose. It was to become one of the largest rose collections in the world, unsurpassed until the creation of Sangerhausen in Germany and La Haye outside of Paris a century later. Her fascination led to some of the most important work in rose hybridizing during the early years of the 19th century. And the property had 250 varieties of roses. The French writer de Pronville stated in 1814 that there were only about 182 varieties of roses, but by the mid-century, due to the keen interest in hybridizing, there were more than 6,000 varieties. Josephine's head gardener was a Frenchman named André Dupont, and he, with Henry de Vilmorin and Jacques-Louis Desmas, were the earliest cultivators of roses from seed. So her dominant roses in her garden were Gallicas. There she had over 150 different cultivars. There were albas, believed to have been introduced to Europe by the Romans. Centifolias, which the name means 100 petals, which obviously there's more than 100 petals in that one. And damask roses brought to Europe by the Crusaders. And Rosa sulphurea. Now this is the yellow rose that was one of the very, very few yellow roses. This appeared in Vienna via Persia. The roses in her garden were crossbred and new rose varieties were developed. The goal was to reduce the distance between bloom times. They wanted to have roses that were remontant, which means to rebloom. And roses which lacked that ability were called once flowering or summer flowering. So few wild rose species possess that reblooming trait. The ones that are exceptions to that were Rosa chinensis, Rosa rugosa, and Rosa fetchenkowana. Now that rose was named after a Polish duchess, I believe it was, or Polish countess. And over 200 varieties of roses were planted in Malmaison. Of the 107 were forms of Rosa gallica, 32 were centifolias, and 8 were damask, 7 were albas, 20 were chinas. The remaining of them came from wide variety of species, including a really tiny one called pimpinifolia, and there were some from the United States. So we're going to move into what she had in her garden so you can see what she was working with. So here's Rosa gallica, still grown today. This is Rosa gallica versicolor. And this is it in the garden, in a garden. It's not in my garden, but it's in a garden. It's a beautiful thing with that really pretty pinky red and stripes, and it smells wonderful. Rosa alba is another beautiful rose, and if you grow this, you know the petals are almost tissue paper thin, and it's a beautiful thing. And here it is growing in a garden. It's such a pretty, why they didn't pick the petaloids out of that, I don't know, but anyway, it's a gorgeous rose. Rosa centifolia. This is the one that people thought was the cabbage rose, is why they called it that. And if your grandmother grew roses, she probably had a Rosa centifolia in her garden. You can see it's got this cupped form and lots of petals, and it kind of looks like a headed cabbage according to the person that named it. So here it is in a garden. This is not a terribly good picture, but you can see its growth habit. It wants to grow relatively upright, lots of side buds, so it gets big clusters of blooms, always with this center one first, and then the side ones come out. Really pretty pink. Here you can see how thin the petals are, but it's got this lovely deep pink, and then it fades to a pale pink on the outside as it ages. Rosa damascena, which this is a beautiful rose. It's used for attar of roses. They use it a lot in the Mid East for rose water, rose oil, and rose syrup. You can see in this picture it has big sprays and they fade to white as they age. This one is commercially harvested. The petals are also edible. It's used as a tea, and they preserve it in sugar as a decoration or as a part of a dessert. But its biggest use right now is in perfumery. So here it's also known as the damask rose or the rose of Castile. So you can see here how many petals it has, and its scent is the best early in the morning. So the people that harvest this, there's a whole field of them waiting for harvest. The people that harvest this harvest it early in the morning while the dew is still on. It takes tons and tons of petals. But now they believe this is a hybrid crossed with Rosa gallica and Rosa moscata. It's also a repeat bloomer, and they think that somewhere in its lineage it's got a remontant rose that made that happen. But isn't that field gorgeous? And then we have this Rosa sulphurea, and I had a hard time finding a picture of this. This picture is done by yeah, why did his name just go right out of my head? Well, we'll talk about him later, but this one is also called Rosa hemispherica. It's a rose species with that pale yellow flower. It's native to Western Asia, and the wild form has single flowers with 5 petals. The double-flowered form was one of the first yellow roses introduced to European gardens. And in 1815, it had been cultivated in England for nearly 200 years. However, the name Rosa sulphurea also refers to what the scent was, and it was such an unpleasant scent, not many people wanted it in their garden. However, after much searching, I did find a picture of it. Now, I don't grow this rose. I probably wouldn't like growing a rose that smelled like sulfur in my yard, but it's got a rather messy growth habit. It's not neat and tidy petals at all, and it does have that sulfury smell. But it's one of the roses that allows us to have yellow roses now.
Hey, Gerri.
Yes, sir.
You were talking earlier about Rosa moscata. I just wanted to mention it's one of the few species roses that repeat blooms, and it's native to North Africa, so it's naturally a repeat bloomer.
Right, and they wanted to use that trait, the DNA for that, in their breeding program. And because she was from Martinique, she had seen this rose and knew that it rebloomed. But thank you. I didn't realize it was from North Africa. That's cool. So why was her garden so important? Well, other than the fact that it was a large collection, there were 4 roses that she acquired that were important to France and the rose world. Slater's Crimson China was one, Parsons Pink, Hume's Blush Tea-Scented China, that came to her through Kennedy and Lee in England, and Park's Yellow Tea-Scented China. They were among the first new repeat or remontant roses to come from China, which helped produce the repeat bloomers, along with Rosa moscata. The tea-scented yellow China was distributed, and it was called Rosa indica flavescens. It's a seedling of Hume's Blush. The rose in commerce as Park's Yellow Tea is not the original. It's likely that the original was lost over 100 years ago. But China roses generally flower continuously on smallish bushes, and their flowers are loose and informal, although often nicely pointed in the buds. For temperate climates, they're virtually evergreen, like in our climate here. So you're seeing on this slide the roses that were the beginning of the modern rose. Crosses made from these roses eventually led to the roses we have in our garden. So here's the ones that were in Europe: Rosa canina, the dog rose, Rosa gallica, Rosa moscata, Rosa phoenicia. This one is really hard to say, but it's Fedchen koana and autumn damask. The oriental roses that were brought in via the Kennedy and Lee people, and by getting them off the ships, that they put roses in for ballast when they had the tea, when they brought tea over, were Old Blush, which is also Parsons Pink China, Slater's Crimson China, Park's Yellow Tea-Scented Rose, and that's the one that they think has disappeared, and Hume's Blush. So Redouté is the gentleman who illustrated these, and this is his version of Slater's Crimson China. Now here's Slater's Crimson China growing in the garden. And you can see the form of the rose here, this kind of bush. They're not big flowers, but they repeat bloom, and that was the key. Here's the Redouté version of Parsons Pink China. And you can see these have those long, narrow leaves that the China roses have, like the green rose, Rosa chinensis viridiflora, has those long, narrow leaves like that. So does, oh shoot, I'll think of it. There's several of the Chinas that still exhibit this leaf shape. So here's Parsons Pink China growing. Again, like they said, the kind of an annual sort of not very organized shape. The bloom itself is a little formal looking. They have these more leaves. Grows on a smallish bush. Hume's Blush, kind of a salmony pink in this painting. Here it is growing in the garden. It's got the darker pink in the center and the lighter pink on the outside edges. Again, that rather informal form and these kind of narrow leaf structures. Rosa canina. This is not a Redouté painting, but this is a botanical print of Rosa canina, which was a single rose. It had 5 petals. Most usually 4 to 8 petals would be the modern version of this. It had a hip that was long and elongated, not the fat round hip, to form the seeds. And you can see it had the leaflets and prickles, not thorns, prickles. So here's the dog rose growing in the garden, and you can see the nice substance. And the little buds here, lots of stamens. And there's what the bush looks like. It has those nice long arching canes, and it blooms all along in little short laterals off the main canes. And then Rosa gallica officinalis. And here it is. It's also known as the apothecary rose. It had lots of different names. There it is. And it got the name apothecary rose because the monks used it a lot for medicinal use. But it's a rather tidy bush, and it's got really pretty pink blooms, and it smells good. And here's Rosa moscata. It has small, rather elongated hips, lovely 5-petal blooms, pretty white thing. And here it is growing in the garden. It's a small bloom, not very big at all, but the real value of it was a rebloomer. Not a good picture, but you can see it blooms in clusters on these arching canes. So you'd have like a big snowball in your backyard or in your front yard. And here's Rosa phoenicia. They're tiny little blooms. They have this almost like a dogwood shaped dogwood petal. They've got that little dip in the middle of the petal and bright yellow stamens. This is the one with the name that trips me up every time, Rosa fetchinkoana. Now, this is a drawing. This is not a Redite painting, but you can see the little hips. You can see it's extremely thorny. Kind of reminds me of Stanwell Perpetual. Has all of those blasted little prickles all over it. And here it is growing in the garden. The hips even have prickles on them. Who'd want to pick that, honestly? But here you have the pretty little white bloom, bright yellow stamens, really pretty leaf sets. Autumn damask is another rose that she used. This is a gorgeous thing. And here it is in all of its glory. It's a really pretty rose. It smells good too. So this is a painting of part of her garden outside of her rose garden. This is would be what they called a cutting garden. It would have lots of annuals and perennials in it. But she loved her gallicas. She loved her China roses. She also enjoyed the rugosas and the Virginia roses from North America. Now, who did all of this work for her? Well, there were a couple of people, and they need to be mentioned because if it wasn't for them, they wouldn't all be here. And I need to find where I talk about this nice gentleman. Here we go. This is Thomas Blakely. He was from Scotland. He settled in Paris, where he became known for planting the remarkable garden at the Bagatelle. And that was like an Anglo-Chinese style of garden. And he helped lay out the gardens of Malmaison for Empress Josephine. He also renovated a couple of parks in Paris. He was really, really determined to make her garden look beautiful. And then they hired James Lee and Lewis Kennedy. Now, I can find a picture. This is a woodcut of James Lee. I could not find a picture anywhere, and I have looked for 2 years for a picture of Lewis Kennedy. There's probably one around. I just haven't found it. But they had a nursery called the Vineyard Nurseries in Hammersmith, London. And he also worked with Blakely to lay out the gardens. And I have to tell you, there's one They had all kinds of designs that they looked at before they settled on the one that they had. And there was one plan that was never used that laid out the garden in a design close to the design of the Union Jack for the British flag. But that was never used. They didn't think it would be appropriate, and Napoleon probably wouldn't have liked it. The other gentleman who helped out was Andre Dupont. Now, Andre Dupont, again, hard to find a picture of this man, but he made it possible for this worldwide search for roses, and he brought them to Malmaison. He grew 200 new varieties. Most of them were new introductions. And this is a flyer that they had about him, and it was a program that was put on in Malmaison about the palace and the roses from 1742 to 1817. By 1830, some 2,500 different rose varieties were available to Parisian rose lovers, all because of Josephine's zeal for rose collecting. Wasn't the first time somebody wanted a garden that was just one plant in the garden, but she made a career of this. So this is another view of Malmaison when she was putting in the gardens. Here you see the boxes with the topiaries, and off in the distance is where the rose garden was. So how did they all survive at Malmaison? Well, after Lee and Kennedy got them there, and they had all the pelargoniums and the Cape Provence and all of the subtropical plants that she brought from Martinique. There were fuchsias, there were China roses, there were bananas and citrus. They built an orangerie, which was like a glorified greenhouse, and this is what it looked like. It had all these tall windows, and it would have been one big open room with probably columns to help support the roof. It is now a private residence. And so this has been divided up into rooms, and it's got staircases and 2 stories, and that's not what it was when it was the orangerie. It was heated with coal and fireplaces and kept warm to keep the plants from freezing. And you can see here there's a palm tree that grew outside, and she had other palms in pots along here and citrus trees in big topiary boxes that came and went out of the orangerie. So who kept the records for this place? Well, Pierre-Joseph Redoute. Now, if you've seen those Redoute drawings, and we saw a few of them earlier when I was showing you the pictures of the roses, he was commissioned to illustrate each rose and keep a record of the species and varieties. He was a botanist as well as an artist, and he made 169 colored drawings of roses from the garden at Malmaison. His finest achievement is considered to be the publication of Les Roses in 1817, and that's where he recorded those 4 China roses, the stud Chinas. Many of those roses are still grown in gardens today. There are people who believe that his portrait drawing capture of the rose Blush Noisette is an all-time masterpiece of illustration. And even after the exile and death of Napoleon, Redoute continued to paint for Louis Philippe, the new Bourbon king, and he died at 1840 at 81 years old. He had a partner, Claude Antoine Torrey. Now, he was also a botanist, and he did the commentary for the roses in Redoute's book, Les Roses. It became a standard reference work on roses for many years. It's still being used now to identify those older varieties of roses. And Torrey made the first attempt to untangle the genealogy of roses. Much of his work was proved to be accurate, and it's still being used today when they find these roses that are growing in old cemeteries, on old homesteads, around old buildings, and they're looking for the for what the lineage was on them. some of his work is still being used for that. So she had a lot of experts. This is a picture of one of the volumes of Les Roses. You can find this book or reprints of this book. The originals, they're huge volumes. There's 3 of them, and they were issued between 1817 and 1824. If you find an original print, it's worth more money than I'd want to spend, but you can get reprints of it. So other important roses that were used in the hybridizing program at Malmaison were Rosa Carolina. Now, I talked about the fact that some of these roses came from North America, and this is one of them. So this is Redout's painting illustration of Rosa Carolina. You can see it's a 4 to 8 petal rose, blooms in clusters. It's got these lovely leaflets on this stem, and it gets these little tiny hips. It's also known as the pasture rose because it likes to grow along the edges of pastures in open fields. And here you see the really bright yellow stamens and that beautiful pink. And it's a very tidy little shrub. It doesn't get very big, kind of low growing. She also used Rosa Setagira. So there is this lovely little pink. It has kind of almost quilted looking leaves and lovely little 5 petals. It's also known as the Illinois rose, and it's a climber. Grows along fence roses if it's still growing wild in the fields, if they haven't killed it off with weed killer. And it's got beautiful stamens. You can see it fades to a pale pink. This is it growing on a fence row. Really pretty, and the little laterals, those little clusters of roses just stand up like little soldiers all along that lateral cane. She also used Rosa spinosissima, and those of you that are remember, there's several spinosissima roses, but they are very, very prickly, and they have really pretty hips. Their hips are, if you can see them, they're almost a purple. They're so dark, and they get these really lovely little white blooms. So here's Rosa spinosissima, and grows in a very large bush. Stanwell's perpetual is a spinosissima. So if you've ever grown Stanwell's perpetual, you know it's got long, slender canes with clusters of blooms, and that's the growth habit of this one, and really, really, really prickly. Rosa indica vulgaris. Now you're seeing that this one has more petals. It's got kind of longer, thinner leaflets, a little bit of a cupped shape. So we're getting into something that looks a little bit more like what we're used to seeing. This is what it looks like when it's fully open, but you can see it's got those almost Eastern style rose leaflets. And here's the little pretty stamens. There's a spent bloom back there. So what happened to Josephine's gardeners? We know she died, and obviously something had to happen to them. They needed to go somewhere. This is a shot of part of the rose garden as it is now. And I just thought this was pretty, the way they had pillared these roses up in these obelisks, and then they've planted along with it as to fill in the rest of the garden, all of these bedding plants, perennials and annuals. Many of the men who trained at Malmaison went on to become rose hybridizers. And for many years, France was the premier country in rose breeding. During her residence at Malmaison, André Dupont amassed nearly 260 species and cultivars. He passed that legacy on to Alexander Hardy, who took over the Luxembourg garden and raised many roses we still grow today, including Mademoiselle Hardy and Safrano. Hardy took on a young assistant at his Luxembourg garden, Jacques-Julien Margottin, who founded his own rose nursery. Margottin and his son Jules kept alive Josephine's dream and continued to grow and hybridize roses. So here you can see the border, and some of those roses are contained within the garden along with the bedding plants. And originally, these borders were 2 meters wide and had different varieties of roses, with a dwarf version that would be planted next to the large version. So now they've changed the way this is laid out, but originally would have been tall rose, dwarf version of tall rose, dwarf version of tall rose, alternating all along that hedge. So how did they save that legacy? Well, here's Roseraie de Val-de-Marne, which is also known as Roseraie de la Haye, and the garden at Vronskov Palace in the Ukraine. What do these have to do with it? Well, after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, the British troops were given instructions that when they entered Paris, they were to protect the roses of Malmaison. That same year, Decimet was forced to abandon his nursery in Saint-Denis on the outside of Paris. His seedling stock was rescued by a fellow grower, Jean-Pierre Weber, who escaped and brought it safely to his nursery on the Marne, to the east of Paris. Decimet went to Russia to be in charge of the Tsar's gardens at Odessa, and this is part of those gardens. And Weber sent many of those seedlings to be propagated there. It was written that the garden at Malmaison was destroyed by the Prussians in the 1870-71 Franco-Prussian War, but not all of it was lost. The collection was recreated at Roseraie de la Haye by Jules Gravereau. So that's this garden right here. So what does Malmaison look like now? Well, this is an aerial view of Malmaison and the reconstruction of the rose garden. This is the main house and the topiaries and the trees, and then this is the long allée that you saw in the original picture. This is the rose garden. There's a central planting and pathways with boxwood hedges and the roses growing in between. So Napoleon returned and took residence in the house after the Battle of Waterloo and before he was sent off to St. Helena. Josephine lived at Malmaison after the divorce, and her cultivation of plants ended in 1814. She died from pneumonia. Just as an aside, she was walking in the garden with the Russian Tsar Alexander. She caught a cold and ended up with pneumonia. But her Australian plants were all distributed across France following her death, down along the Côte d'Azur, as well as other countries around the Mediterranean. The techniques that she developed at Chateau de la Malmaison for the cultivation of flowers have since been improved and simplified and added to. After her death, Malmaison was left to neglect, and it seems that some of the roses were dug up after she died. Now, there's a rumor that they were stolen. Maybe some of her rival gardeners or rival people that owned chateaus wanted to take those roses and grow them in their garden so that their garden would be lovely. But the chateau changed hands many times after she died, and it eventually fell into disrepair. It was purchased and later sold to the French government. It's now a tourist destination, as we talked about in the beginning. And it was fully restored in the early 20th century and now considered an important historical monument. So let's look at this reconstructed garden. Here you see the central planting. This is now to the left of the chateau. They put this in 2014 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of her death. So this garden is a showcase of antique roses, gallicas, damasks, albas, bourbons, hybrid perpetuals, and they're grouped according to their classification. So each one of these triangles has, this might have bourbons, this might have hybrid perpetuals, and so forth around the central planting. Each of those 8 triangular beds radiates out from this middle bed. And in the middle is the lone modern specimen called Souvenir de Josephine. It's a 2014 pink introduction. The paths are lined with closely cropped boxwood, and you can see them here and along here. And inside, the roses are mixed with shorter perennials, peonies, echinacea, and poppies. And then there's some tall green shrubs all around. Unfortunately, it's not an exact recreation of her garden because many of these roses did not exist until after Josephine died. So the rose that's named Souvenir de la Malmaison was developed and named after she died, but this is Redout's interpretation of the rose. It was introduced in 1843 by Jean Beluz. Of course, the name means a remembrance of Malmaison. And it stands as a reminder of that moment in time when her garden was the center of the rose universe for that brief few years. Here it is in a garden growing. You can see the really soft petals. They're very thin. You've got this really pretty little bud, and you can see the leaves here. They have little finely toothed edges. So along with that, there are roses that were named for Josephine and her family. This is the one, Rosa Empress Josephine. It's a pretty little pink thing. It is the 2 that are named for her. There's this one and another rose called Empress Josephine, that one, and one called Josephine de Beauharnais, which was her name before she married Napoleon. This rose, Madness at Corsica, is named for Napoleon because, of course, he was considered to be a bit mad. It was introduced in 1835 and bred by Jean Lafay. It's named for his birthplace and probably because he was a little crazy. But it's kind of casual, not very well organized petals. This one is Rosa Eugene de Beauharnais. It's named for one of her children. The breeder who produced Josephine de Beauharnais also bred Hortense de Beauharnais, which is another pink rose, and Eugene. But Eugene was named after Josephine's son. It's a climber, and it may just be the best of the Bonaparte roses. It's a beautiful rose. You see the little points on on the petals? Right in the center of each petal, there's that little point. Smells good, and if it's a climber, can you imagine a whole wall full of that? It would be beautiful. This is an overview of the garden at Malmaison. You can see how there are plantings on the property that are not in the exact garden that we showed to the left of the residence. These were planted for the tourists to come and see, and it's mass plantings of all of these beautiful old garden roses. This is the rose garden in 2016. Now, you see those roses in pots. That's a reference to how Josephine grew most of her roses to exhibit them. During the wintertime, those pots could be moved into the orangerie. And when they were blooming, they would be moved out into the garden. After they were finished blooming, they'd be swapped out with whatever was blooming in the orangerie, and these would be retired until they came back into bloom. The entrance garden has a long row of tall clay pots holding roses like Maiden's Blush. And the Malmaison guidebook tells us that the roses were not planted in the ground until the latter part of the 19th century. Amongst the species roses, Fraxinifolia features bright red canes and dark red leaves, and it was a one-plant counterpoint to the idea that once blooming roses should be hidden away when they weren't in bloom, because the canes and the foliage were so beautiful on that plant. The Portlands and the Bourbons and the Chinas were the real entertainment in the garden, and many of those varieties would have been unknown to Josephine. The arrival of Noisettes in France from South Carolina came at the same time as Josephine's death, and the Bourbons were at least a few years away from being introduced to the garden. So here you can see this beautiful planting with the little trimmed boxwoods. This is in LA in the garden where they've put arches over the walkway and trained the roses in varying colors along the archways. I can't imagine how heavenly that must smell as you walk down through there. And then there's a focal point at the end of the walkway. It's just gorgeous. Here they've grown a modern rose. This is Florentina, and they've pillared it up this obelisk so it can show off its beautiful blooms. And you can see in the back here they've got the taller perennials that looks like it could be delphiniums. And then there's some other roses planted behind that. Here there's some lavender. It's either lavender or purple stalk. There's more delphiniums there. So it's a beautiful layout of the garden, and they've got them all tagged and marked so you can see what the names of the roses are. Here you see another view of the LA with all of the arches. This is before it's all out in full bloom. This is probably earlier in the year. And the layout of the beds. And this is a view of Souvenir de la Malmaison, looking at Malmaison. And you can see there's some underplanting. This looks like it's a little bit later in the year. These look like maybe summer blooms. And Malmaison blooming. This is one of the side gardens. It would have been the kitchen garden probably when Malmaison was a residence. And they would have grown probably roses in there as well as things for the kitchen, herbs and different things for cooking. But roses were also used as a edible item and for aromatherapy and for beauty purposes. So they would have had a garden with some of those roses to be used for those purposes. And this is just a lovely view of the back side of one of the cutting gardens. You can see they've built this retaining wall, and then they have plants up here. This looks like perennials, some gazanias or some sort of daisies here. Just a real pretty little spot. So thank you for listening and watching. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did doing all the research, because it was great fun. Let me get rid of this. I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Gerri. That was beautiful.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun for me to put it together. I haven't had as much fun researching a topic in a long time. And then when that article came out in the ARS magazine, I was like, oh, wow, this is perfect. So do read that, because there are some really interesting notes in that article about what they grew and how they grew it and what is available now. So if you wanted to have your own Souvenir de la Josephine or Malmaison, you could do that. You could get those roses. And actually, some of the old garden roses do really well in our climate. Some of them won't bloom here. Now, there's a rose called Seven Sisters that won't bloom in Phoenix. It might bloom in parts of Tucson if you get enough chill days. There was a lady, and I don't know if she's still connected with your Rose Society, Casey, and she used to grow some really amazing roses that had to have a certain number of chill days, but she lived up on the hillside, so she could get away with that, like Father Hugo and some of those.
High Country Roses is a good source of old garden roses if you want to try some, and they're really
Yeah.
fun to grow.
Yeah, and I really, didn't you have Himalayan musk at one time in your yard, Terry?
I did, but everyone has a short lifespan in my garden, so it's
Well,
probably.
I know, but it was like a house eater. It took over almost all your backyard, if I remember correctly. It was a giant thing back there in the back behind your,
Well, and
was that
I
Oh,
had
mermaid?
mermaid back there too. Have you ever grown mermaid?
that's another house eater.
That's a house eater, but beautiful, huge white blooms. But
Yeah,
yeah, fishhook thorns.
yeah, and it'll take over the world. So before you plant an old garden rose, do a little research and figure out how big it's going to get, because sometimes especially in our climate, they will get, if it says 2x2, it'll be more like 4x4.
Yeah.
You know, they're pretty big. Oh, he's so cute, Crystal. He wants to see what mom's doing. There he is. Oh, what a cutie.
This is
I get to see
Daytona.
everybody's kitties and doggies when I'm on this. So, and I saw Judy's dog a little while ago walking around.
Yeah, he said it's
Yeah,
time to go to bed.
Yeah, he wants
yeah.
you to go to bed now, Mom. So thank you for asking me. This was a lot of fun for me. I hope you enjoyed it. There's so much history there. We could go on and we won't, because I'd put you all
Thank
to
you.
sleep. But
It's very interesting.
yeah, it is. It's just fascinating how we got from there to here. I just picked
Yeah.
a huge bouquet of Gemini and took them to my neighbor today. So we wouldn't have those otherwise. Taffy, what did you want, dear? You had a question? I can't hear you, honey. Your microphone.
Kathy,
There we go. Go ahead.
Kathy had asked in chat if the American Rose article is available online.
I don't believe so. I think it's only in the magazine.
Okay. All right.
I think one of the most interesting things about the presentation was that it didn't matter that the countries were at war. Just
No.
forget it. Kill all the people, but save the roses.
Save the
Save the
roses and
roses.
get them to Josephine, because her gardeners need them, because they need to hybridize these roses. I thought that was just astonishing that these gardeners from England had a free ride pass. They could come and go as they chose. As long as they were hauling roses to Josephine, it didn't matter. They were good to go. So Taffy, you had another question, and if you want to email that question to me, I will answer it for you, because I can't hear you. Oh, you were asking if I've been to the garden. I have not, but I have several acquaintances that have, and they gave me a lot of information about it. There's a ton of stuff. If you sit down and do the research, there's a lot of stuff online about it. And even the pictures that I had, the most recent ones were 2016. There are some newer iterations of it out there online again, because the French government, now owning the property, they update the tourist information periodically. Of course, with the COVID, they've been locked down worse than we have. So I'm sure that, they haven't done anything new in a little while. But there's a lot of really good information out there. If you weed through it, it just takes a while to weed through it. That's why this article in the ARS magazine was so helpful for referring people to it, because it debunks some of the myths that, stories people have made up about her. So,
All right.
so
Well, thank
even
you.
though she got divorced, she ended up with the house and the garden, and she didn't live very long afterwards, but she got it all, which was highly unusual for that day and age. So y'all have a good evening. Thank you again for having me. I'm going to go ahead and leave the meeting so you can take care of whatever business you need to take care of. But Thanks again, and I hope to see all of you later on, maybe later in the year or maybe the beginning of the year. Oh, fingers
What?
crossed, if everything goes well, fingers crossed, knees crossed, whatever you need to cross. The Rose Society of Glendale is going to try to have a rose show the first Saturday in November. We're going to attempt it. So watch this space for further development. It will totally depend on the city of Glendale and on what the restrictions are at the time. But we're going to move forward as though it's going to happen, and then we'll be able to start advertising it later on. We got time, but something to think about and look forward to. So we'll see you guys.
I'll come judge.
All right.
Thank you
so much.
Yeah, we'll see you there, Terry. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good
Good
night,
night,
everybody.
everybody.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else we need to address from anybody, I'm gonna go tuck my child into to bed. So it was great seeing you guys. If you have the article, read it. If you've got ways to share it with people, do that too. So yeah, good night, and I'll see you guys in May. Okay.
Bye.